4:47 a.m. Vinton County, Ohio. A gravel road off State Route 293. Deputy Lena Marsh killed her headlights 200 yards before the gate. She pulled onto the shoulder and sat. The farmhouse sat back from the road behind a stand of bare oaks. A hand-painted chapel sign leaned against the gate post. A 4-H banner hung from the fence wire, faded from summer sun. The banner had been there long enough that the fabric had separated at the top hem, splitting in two places where the wire had cut through the weave. Nobody had replaced it. Nobody had taken it down. It had simply been left there, accumulating seasons. She had been here once before. 6 days ago. A routine welfare check. A man answered the door. Polite. The residents were fine, he said. She drove away. She should not have. There was one small thing that would not let her go. A single number on a piece of paper. An unpaid propane invoice flagged to the county for a house showing heavy overnight power draw on the rural electrical grid. The invoice was 9 months past due. But the power draw was current, consistent, and high. A cold, empty house doesn't pull power like that. She filed a supplemental report that same night. Over the next 29 days, what that report triggered would bring together a county deputy, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, an FBI regional task force, and a convoy of vehicles staged behind a grain elevator outside MacArthur. It would end before sunrise on a morning in late February 2026, with a padlocked farmhouse breached and a count that was not the 4 registered at that address. The count was 14. The property at the end of that gravel road was registered to a man named Gerald Colton, 61, and his wife Norma, 58. Their son, Dwayne Colton, 34, and his common-law partner, a woman named Stacy Briggs, 29, were listed as secondary residents. According to the county records, 4 residents were registered at the address. Ages ranged from 18 to 29. Homeschooled. Medical exemptions on file. On paper, it was an unremarkable Appalachian household. Chapel sign. 4-H flag. The kind of property that passes through a county system like water through a screen. Lena Marsh had grown up 40 miles from that gate. She had driven past 100 properties that looked exactly like it. That was the problem. Familiarity is camouflage. The propane invoice had arrived at the county's social services office as part of a routine utility assistance scan. Delinquent accounts flagged for potential welfare need. An intake clerk named Sandra Hoover noticed the property was flagged in multiple systems and cross-referenced it. The power draw notation came from a rural cooperative billing anomaly report, a quarterly digest that almost no one read. Sandra Hoover read it. She forwarded it to the county sheriff's liaison desk with a single handwritten note: Colton property. 4 registered residents. Power draw equivalent to 11 occupied rooms. No active propane. January in Ohio. Marsh got the note on the morning of January 28, 2026. She drove out that same afternoon for the welfare check. Gerald Colton answered the door in under 30 seconds. That was the second thing that did not add up. A man who had been sitting right next to the door, waiting. She asked to see the residents. He brought 4 of them to the doorway. All dressed. All quiet. None of them looked at her directly. Not sideways glances. Not the ordinary wariness of residents in front of a uniformed stranger. They looked at the floor with a quality of attention that was not wariness at all. It was practiced. Marsh had 6 years of welfare check experience at that point. She had stood at a lot of doorways with residents on the other side. The way those 4 stood, arranged in a loose row just inside the doorframe, did not resemble the body language of people who simply happened to be there. She could not compel entry on that visit. She drove away. That night, she spent 4 hours going through the case file, cross-referencing every document the county had on that address. The welfare record dated back 11 years, to when Gerald and Norma Colton had first registered as foster carers in Athens County before transferring their filing residency to Vinton. There had been 3 home visits over 11 years, all marked compliant. All 3 visits had been conducted by the same caseworker, a man who had retired in October 2025. 3 visits in 11 years. Guidance recommended annual checks for active foster placements. 1 visit every 3.5 years. The strangest part was not the gap between visits. The strangest part was that the caseworker's retirement had never triggered a file reassignment. The Colton file had been sitting unassigned in the county system for 4 months. It had fallen through the exact seam between 2 bureaucratic systems. Marsh filed a formal escalation request the next morning. She did not know yet how large the seam was. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation received Marsh's escalation on February 2, 2026. A supervisor named Agent Calvin Pruitt took the preliminary. He ran the Colton property through 4 databases in an afternoon and found 3 things that did not fit. First, the electrical cooperative's data showed a consistent overnight draw in the range, associated with a structure housing 8 to 12 people. The draw pattern had been consistent for at least 14 months. Second, Gerald Colton had a sealed juvenile record in West Virginia from the early 1990s, not visible at the county level, accessible only through a BCI interstate query. Third, a woman named Dolores Kessler, 63, listed as Gerald Colton's sister, had an open Child Protective Services referral in Gallia County from the previous March. That referral listed 5 residents at her address who could not be accounted for at a school visit. The Gallia County referral had been marked inactive when the residents were subsequently produced at a home visit. The caseworker noted they appeared healthy. The Gallia County caseworker had not noted whether those were the same 5 residents who had been unaccounted for initially. Pruitt called Marsh on the evening of February 3rd. He told her to hold on any further direct contact with the property. He was going to request a drone survey and a passive surveillance rotation. He also told her he was going to loop in the FBI's Cincinnati field office, specifically a regional trafficking task force that had been operating out of a substation in Athens since the previous fall. Marsh asked how long the process would take. Pruitt told her he would try to move it in under 2 weeks. She said, "Make it faster." Here's what strikes us about a case like this. The system made contact with that property 3 times in 11 years. 3 visits. Each one satisfied the minimum threshold and closed the file. The question this case puts on the table is not whether any individual caseworker failed. The question is whether a system designed to process volume can ever catch what hides in plain sight behind a chapel sign and a 4-H banner. The Colton property was never invisible. It was legible. No one read it. Before the aerial surveillance was authorized, Pruitt ran a passive vehicle observation rotation on the property. A plainclothes BCI unit in an unmarked pickup made slow passes along State Route 293 on the evenings of February 4th and 5th, logging vehicles visible inside the gate and any movement in and out of the driveway. The report from those 2 observation passes documented 4 distinct vehicles parked on the property. A late-model pickup registered to Gerald Colton. A minivan registered to Stacy Briggs. A panel van with no rear windows registered to a defunct landscaping company that had last filed a tax return in 2022. A dark blue sedan with a temporary tag registered to a used car lot in Huntington, West Virginia, that did not match any known individual in the Colton network file. 4 vehicles for a household nominally comprising 4 adults and 4 residents. The panel van alone had cargo capacity for 12 people. The observation unit also noted lights on the 2nd floor of the farmhouse between 9:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. on both observation nights. Not moving lights. Not the pattern of someone passing through a room. Stationary illumination. Consistent with multiple people occupying a fixed space. Pruitt added both observations to the intelligence package and flagged the panel van for a plate trace. The trace came back to the defunct landscaping company. The company had no registered business address, only a post office box in Cabell County, West Virginia, that had not received mail in over a year. The box was registered to a name that did not appear anywhere else in the Colton network file. A blank wall. It was the kind of dead end that, in another context, might have been where the investigation stalled. Pruitt noted the blank wall, added it to the package, and kept moving. FBI Special Agent Diana Harker drove from Cincinnati to Athens on the morning of February 5th. She reviewed Pruitt's preliminary and Marsh's original welfare report. She requested an emergency authorization for aerial surveillance on the property. The authorization came through in 22 hours. On February 7th, a BCI drone unit ran a survey pass over the Colton property at 600 feet. The flight was conducted at 11:40 a.m., outside of school hours. The imagery was high resolution. What the drone captured: a main farmhouse, 2 stories. The ground floor windows were curtained but not boarded. The second story was different. 3 windows on the north face were covered from the inside with what appeared to be plywood or heavy cardboard. On the south face, a single window had been modified. An exhaust fan had been installed in the frame. It was running. A sealed 2nd floor in January, with active ventilation. The barn, 60 yards from the main structure, showed thermal return consistent with animal occupancy on the lower level and with human range heat signatures on an upper loft level. That thermal data came from a secondary pass at 4:47 a.m. on February 9th. Harker reviewed the imagery the morning of February 10th. She called Pruitt and Marsh into a joint briefing that afternoon. She put the drone stills on a conference table and pointed at the exhaust fan installation. She said, "Someone cut that hole and put that fan in deliberately. You do that because you need air circulation for a population that would otherwise make the space unlivable." Marsh looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she said, "How many people are we talking about?" Harker said they didn't know yet. She said the next step was a K9 alert at the property line and a parallel record sweep on every individual associated with the Colton household in any state database for the past 15 years. She also said the operation needed a staging plan. Whatever they found when they breached that door, they needed resources in place before they crossed the threshold. Medical personnel, emergency social services, transport vehicles. She said, "We are not going in there unprepared to find more than 4. The parallel record sweep took 9 days. What it produced was a picture that no single database had ever assembled. Gerald and Norma Colton had fostered a total of 7 residents through the Athens County system between 2015 and 2022. Of those 7, 2 had aged out of the system and could be located as adults. 3 had been transferred to other placements and were accounted for. 2 had been marked as having transitioned to informal kinship care within the Colton Extended Family Network, a designation that removed them from formal oversight without requiring documentation of where specifically they were living. Informal kinship care. a legal classification that, in practice, meant the residents disappeared into a family network with no further check-ins required. Dwayne Colton and Stacy Briggs had registered 2 biological residents, both listed at the Vinton County address. Dolores Kessler's 5 residents from the Gallia County referral were cross-indexed against birth records, school enrollment data, and medical records across 4 counties. 3 of the 5 appeared in no school or medical record for the preceding 20 months. And then there was a 3rd adult in the network, a man named Roy Tanner, 47, who had lived intermittently at the Colton property according to utility billing addresses going back 4 years. Tanner had a prior conviction in Kentucky for custodial interference. He had served 14 months. Harker's unit mapped every individual connected to the property into a single chart. When they were done, the number of residents who could plausibly be at that address, drawing from the combined population of all the network's unaccounted-for placements, was between 11 and 17. 14 was the midpoint estimate. Harker presented the full intelligence package to the FBI Cincinnati field office on February 16th. She requested a tactical entry authorization with full medical staging. The request was approved in 36 hours. Put yourself in Diana Harker's position at that moment. You have a farmhouse. You have a drone photograph of a sealed 2nd floor with a ventilation fan. You have a thermal pass that suggests human range heat signatures in a barn loft. You have a number, between 11 and 17, that represents residents who exist in official records, but cannot be placed at any other address. You have 29 days since a deputy noticed a propane bill that didn't add up. And you have no way of knowing, until you open that door, whether the count is 10 or 14 or something else entirely. The breach was scheduled for 4:45 a.m. on February 26, 2026. While the tactical plan was being finalized, the investigation's evidence processing unit was working a parallel track that rarely surfaces in the public account of cases like this. Investigators had obtained records under a financial subpoena for every bank account associated with any registered member of the Colton household. The subpoena return took 11 days. When the documents arrived, a forensic accountant named Peter Seal spent 3 days building a transaction map. What he found was not complicated. It was methodical. Benefit payments, including foster care subsidies, disability supplements, and food assistance, had been flowing into 5 separate accounts over a period that stretched back at least 7 years. 2 of those accounts were held in names that appeared nowhere in any current household registration. One was in the name of a woman who had died in 2020, 14 months before the account's last transaction. The total inflow across all 5 accounts, calculated conservatively and limited to the 7-year window for which complete records were available, was approximately $230,000. $230,000 in benefit payments. A house where 14 residents were being held. A laminated schedule on the kitchen wall with 12 names on it. Seal noted in his report that the transaction patterns were not erratic. They were regular. Deposits timed to coincide with government disbursement cycles. Withdrawals in cash consistently within 48 hours of each deposit. The structure suggested someone who understood how benefit systems worked and had organized the household's financial architecture around extracting from them. He used the word architecture deliberately. This had not assembled itself by accident. In the days between the tactical authorization and the breach date, Harker ran 2 more observation passes. Not drone passes. On the evenings of February 20th and 23rd, a plainclothes unit in a utility company vehicle drove slowly past the property under the cover of checking a roadside electrical junction box 40 yards north of the gate. The utility vehicle was a legitimate cooperative truck borrowed for the purpose. The pass on the 20th produced nothing new. The pass on the 23rd documented a vehicle exchange at the gate at approximately 7:15 p.m. The panel van departed. A different vehicle, a late-model SUV with Ohio plates, arrived. It was on the property for 41 minutes. It left. The plates traced to a rental company in Columbus. The rental company's records showed the vehicle had been reserved under a name that also appeared in the financial transaction map. Not a direct match to any Colton household member. A lateral connection. Someone associated with the money. Harker flagged the rental record and passed it to the Financial Investigation Unit. She did not delay the breach to pursue it. The residents on that second floor had been there long enough. The convoy staged behind a grain elevator on County Road 12, 8/10 of a mile from the gate, at 3:15 a.m. 12 vehicles in total. A BCI tactical unit of 8 operators. A 4-person FBI trafficking task force element, including Harker. 2 K-9 units from the Athens County Sheriff. 4 Vinton County deputies, including Lena Marsh. A medical staging unit, 2 paramedic teams, and an emergency nurse from Ohio Regional Medical. 6 social services emergency response workers with transport capacity for up to 18 individuals. The operational plan called for simultaneous entry at the farmhouse front door and the barn. The padlock on the farmhouse door had been identified in the drone imagery. A bolt cutter team was assigned to the front approach. A second element would hold at the barn. Harker's radio call sign for the operation was Orchard. At 3:52 a.m., the K-9 unit made a slow pass along the fence line at the southern property boundary. The 2 dogs, both narcotics and human scent trained, alerted at 2 locations. First at a position adjacent to the barn's north wall. Second at a ground-level vent on the farmhouse's east foundation wall. Neither location had been identified as a point of interest in the drone survey. Harker noted both alert positions on her operational map and radioed a hold-on movement. She spent 8 minutes reassessing the entry plan. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The K-9 alerts at the foundation vent suggested a possible below-grade space. The original plan had not included a basement or crawl space search element. At 3:58 a.m., with less than 50 minutes to planned breach, Harker added a 2-person element specifically tasked with foundation and below-grade clearance. At 4:43 a.m., the convoy moved. No sirens. Headlights extinguished at the 200-yard mark. The bolt cutter team reached the gate in 40 seconds. The padlock came off the chain in 1 cut. The tactical element moved up the gravel drive in a low spread formation. 8 operators fanned across the width of the drive with spacing that would allow the trailing elements to pass through without bottlenecking at the gate. Their boots made almost no sound on the gravel because of the overnight freeze. The ground had gone hard. Every step was deliberate. Nobody spoke. All communication was on radio. The only sounds were the crunch of frozen grass at the verge where 2 operators peeled off to circle the farmhouse's east perimeter, and the distant rhythm of the barn element moving parallel through the tree line to the left. The sky was a flat, dark gray. The farmhouse sat black against it. 3 of the second-floor windows were still covered. One showed a thin line of light at the edge where the cardboard did not quite meet the window frame. Someone was awake. The barn element peeled left at the tree line and moved parallel. At 4:47 a.m., the farmhouse front door came open. Not with a ram. The door itself was not locked. Only the exterior gate had been padlocked. The door swung open on the first push. The first thing the entry team encountered in the dark front room was a smell. The initial radio call from the team leader, recorded in the operation log, used the word foul. It was a specific compound of odors that the entry team leader would later describe in his after-action statement as unlike anything he had encountered in residential entry in 14 years of tactical operations. Not the smell of a house that had been neglected. Something more enclosed than that. More concentrated. The kind of smell that accumulates in a space where ventilation is insufficient and population density is high, and the conditions have been the same way for a long time. The lights came on. The ground floor was a single large living area and kitchen. It was occupied. A man matching Gerald Colton's description was in a recliner chair. He came to his feet immediately. He was handcuffed and taken to the porch within 30 seconds. Norma Colton was found in a back bedroom. Dwayne Colton and Stacy Briggs were in a second bedroom on the ground floor. All 4 adults were in custody within 2 minutes and 40 seconds of entry. The ground floor held 2 registered residents, asleep in a side room. The count was 2. The team leader called it up on the radio. 2 on the ground floor. Proceeding to the second level. The staircase to the second floor was blocked by a plywood partition nailed to the stud wall. A sliding bolt had been installed on the partition from the ground floor side. Facing down. The bolt controlled access from below. The partition came down in under 90 seconds. The second floor was one long open space, previously 2 bedrooms with the dividing wall removed. There were mattresses on the floor. There were no beds. There were no dressers, no personal items visible, no books. There was a single bare bulb on a cord from the ceiling. The exhaust fan they had seen from the drone was mounted in the south window frame. It was still running. The team leader's radio call, transmitted at 4:52 a.m. and preserved in the operations communications log, used 2 words. Many residents. The count, completed at 5:19 a.m., when the last 2 individuals were located in the barn loft by the secondary element, was 14. 8 on the second floor of the farmhouse. 4 on the ground floor, including the 2 initially registered. 2 in the barn loft. Ages, determined at the medical staging area on the porch and driveway, ranged from 18 to 35. 14 residents. 4 adults. A padlocked gate. A sealed second floor. A barn loft. And 1 exhaust fan that had been running, quietly, through the entire Ohio winter. The tactical element's role ended at 5:21 a.m. when the last adult was secured. From that point, the operation became a medical and social services operation. The emergency nurse who was first into the second floor space that morning, a woman named Ruth Calloway, gave a statement to BCI investigators the following day. She was asked to describe the condition of the space. Her statement runs to 4 paragraphs. The clinical language is precise and institutional throughout. The final sentence of her statement reads, "The conditions were consistent with prolonged confinement in an inadequately ventilated space with insufficient sanitation facilities." Calloway did not elaborate further in the official record. She did not need to. The documentation speaks for itself. What the documentation does not capture, because official records are not built to hold it, is what the social services emergency response workers encountered in the minutes immediately following the tactical clearance. The 6 workers on site had a combined total of over 40 years of emergency placement experience. They had prepared, based on the midpoint estimate, to receive up to 15 residents in acute distress. The preparation included comfort kits, emergency food rations, thermal blankets, and a triage protocol designed for residents who might be frightened, disoriented, or nonverbal following emergency removal. The triage protocol was designed for chaos. It was not needed in the way they expected. because several of the residents on the second floor did not behave like people who had just been woken up in the middle of the night by a team of strangers in tactical gear moving through their space. Several were already awake. 1. A resident who was later determined to be 23 years old was sitting upright on her mattress when the first responders came through the partition. She was dressed. She was watching the door. When the first worker entered the space, the resident did not speak. She looked at the worker steadily and then looked at the other mattresses, one by one, as if conducting her own count. She did not appear frightened. She appeared to be assessing whether the situation was under control. She had been doing that for a long time. The social services supervisor who wrote up the initial intake notes described her as having what she called an operational awareness that she had only ever seen previously in residents who had learned to manage dangerous environments as a matter of daily survival. All 14 residents were transported to a regional medical facility by 6:40 a.m. on February 26th. All 14 were assessed. All 14 were admitted for evaluation and treatment. The duration of medical admission ranged from 4 days to 3 weeks, depending on the individual case. Roy Tanner, the fourth adult associated with the property, was not present at the time of the breach. His vehicle was not in the driveway. His current whereabouts were unknown. He was the first open question. Gerald Colton, Norma Colton, Dwayne Colton, and Stacy Briggs were transported to the Vinton County Sheriff's Office and subsequently transferred to state custody. All 4 were charged under Ohio statutes covering endangering persons, unlawful imprisonment, and related counts. Gerald Colton faced additional charges related to his custody and control of residents, placed through the foster system. In the holding area at the Vinton County Sheriff's Office, a pair of BCI investigators conducted preliminary interviews with each of the 4 adults in the hours following their arrest. The interviews were recorded. None of the 4 made a statement without counsel, which was their right. What the recordings document, in the pauses and the silences and the brief exchanges before each adult invoked that right, is a particular quality of composure that the lead investigator, in a later deposition, described as rehearsed. Not rattled, not frightened, not even particularly surprised. Gerald Colton sat down in the interview chair, was advised of his rights, and said 3 words before declining to speak further without an attorney. The 3 words were, "You found them." He did not ask which residents had been found. He did not ask how many. He said you found them with the flat inflection of a man confirming something he had already calculated as a possibility, and then he folded his hands on the table and did not speak again. Norma Colton asked, once, about the schedule on the kitchen wall. She asked whether it had been taken as evidence. The investigator confirmed that it had. She nodded and did not ask anything else. The investigator noted in the session record that her primary apparent concern, in the immediate aftermath of the breach, was whether a laminated piece of paper had been collected into the evidence chain. The schedule that listed 12 residents' names and their assigned tasks. She wanted to know if investigators had it. They did. The Ohio Attorney General's office issued a statement the following morning. The statement described the conditions at the property using language that, in the measured vocabulary of a state legal office, was notably direct. The statement did not describe those conditions at length. It did not need to. The investigation into how the county system had produced only 3 welfare visits in 11 years was assigned to an independent review panel on February 28th. That panel was still conducting interviews as of the date of this account. We'll say what most won't. 3 home visits in 11 years is not a gap. It is an absence. Whatever individual failures contributed to that record, the structural reality is that a system relying on periodic in-person checks, administered by a single overextended caseworker, who retired without triggering a file reassignment, is not a monitoring system. It is a documentation system. Those are not the same thing. The distinction matters because this was not unique to Vinton County. The parallel investigation into the extended network, the informal kinship placements, the unaccounted for residents from Dolores Kessler's Gallia County referral continued past the breach date. By March 14, 2026, investigators had confirmed the placement of 3 of the 5 Gallia County residents at a secondary address in Lawrence County, Ohio. They were recovered and placed in emergency state care. The other 2 from that referral remained unlocated as of the time this account was compiled. 2 residents, somewhere in the network, not yet found. That was the second open question. The BCI's financial investigation, initiated to determine whether any public assistance funds had been directed to the Colton household in connection with the foster placements, found records indicating that foster care subsidy payments for 2 of the 7 historical placements had continued to be issued to a bank account associated with the Colton household for a combined total of 22 months after those placements were officially marked as having transferred to other custody. The payments totaled approximately $41,000. The account into which those payments were deposited was not Gerald Colton's primary account. It was held in the name of a business entity registered to Norma Colton in 2019. The business entity had no recorded commercial activity. $41,000. Issued by the state. Received by a shell entity. For residents who were no longer on paper at that address. Whether those residents had in fact left the address or whether they had simply been relabeled on paper was a question the investigation was still working to answer. When the forensic accountant Peter Seal presented his complete findings to the Joint Investigative Unit in mid-March, he included a supplementary note that did not appear in the official report, but that he repeated in a subsequent interview with BCI Oversight. He said that in his experience, financial architectures of this complexity, spread across multiple accounts, timed to disbursement cycles, and structured around benefit categories that span different administering agencies, do not develop spontaneously. They are built. They are maintained. They require someone who understands the seams between systems well enough to route money through them without triggering automated flags. The same seams, in other words, that allowed a welfare file to sit unassigned for 4 months after a caseworker's retirement. The same seams that allowed an informal kinship placement to dissolve residents into a family network without a follow-up visit. Different seams in different systems. Someone had learned where all of them were. Whether that someone was inside the Colton household or connected to it through the network represented by the Columbus rental car and the Blank Wall Landscaping Company in West Virginia, was a thread the financial investigation was still pulling. A detail that stuck. In the farmhouse kitchen, investigators found a laminated schedule pinned to the wall beside the refrigerator. It listed names and assigned tasks. Laundry, dishes, water, feeding. The schedule was neatly printed. The names on it numbered 12. The 2 youngest residents, ages 18 and 19, were not on the schedule. They were listed at the bottom under a separate heading. The heading read, "Too small." The schedule had been there long enough that the laminate was yellowed at the edges. Lena Marsh was on the porch of the farmhouse at 6:03 a.m. on February 26th, when the last ambulance left the driveway. She had been on duty for 14 hours. She drove back to the county road and parked. She sat for a while. The chapel sign was still at the gate. The 4-H banner was still on the fence. Both were removed by evidence technicians at 8:15 a.m. Roy Tanner was located in Kanawha County, West Virginia, on March 4, 2026. He was arrested on an Ohio fugitive warrant and extradited. He was charged in connection with the confinement and care of the residents found at the Vinton County property. His case was pending as of the date of this account. In the weeks following the breach, the independent review panel began the work of reconstructing the administrative history of the Colton file from the beginning. Investigators pulled the original foster care registration documents from 2015. They pulled the 3 home visit reports. They interviewed, where they could locate them, the individuals who had signed off on each document in the chain. The first home visit report, from 2016, was 2 pages. Standard compliance checklist. Box checked next to each line item. The caseworker's signature at the bottom. At the time of that visit, 3 residents were registered at the address. The report noted that the home was clean, the residents were appropriately dressed, and the foster parent, Gerald Colton, was cooperative and knowledgeable about the residents' needs. The second report, from 2019, was 1.5 pages. Fewer narrative observations than the first. The caseworker who had written it, the same man who would retire in 2025, had used nearly identical phrasing to the 2016 report. Clean home. Residents appropriately dressed. Foster parent cooperative. The third report, from 2022, was 1 page. It was, in almost every substantive phrase, a copy of the second. 3 reports. The same house. The same family. The same language. Each one closing the file and generating a next check-in date that was not kept until it was. Each one satisfying the minimum requirement for the record. None of them describing anything that the previous one had not described. The file was not a picture of an evolving household. It was a template, refreshed on a 3.5-year cycle. The review panel noted this in its preliminary materials. It did not characterize the caseworker as having acted with intent. It characterized the system as having provided no structural mechanism to prevent a compliant but perfunctory visit pattern from persisting indefinitely over the course of a single worker's caseload. The distinction mattered for determining liability. It did not make the outcome different. The question that the independent review panel was working toward but had not yet answered was this: of the 7 residents placed with the Colton household through the Athens County foster system between 2015 and 2022, how many of the 14 found at the farmhouse were the same individuals? The answer to that question would determine how long this had been operating. Not months. Not 2 years. Possibly longer. The panel was not expected to issue its preliminary findings until late spring. Will the system close the gaps that made this possible? Comment yes or no, because the answer depends entirely on whether anyone is still paying attention 6 months from now. The farmhouse is sealed under an evidence preservation order. The padlock on the gate is gone. The gravel driveway sits empty. The propane account at that address remains delinquent. 9 months past due as of the date of the breach. No one ordered new propane for a year, because whoever was living in that farmhouse, through the fall and into the winter, was generating their own heat another way. A county social worker named Sandra Hoover read a utility anomaly report that almost no one reads. A deputy named Lena Marsh drove back to a house she had already cleared and filed a supplemental report at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. A BCI agent ran 4 databases in an afternoon and found 3 facts that did not belong together. None of them had a specific reason to go further. Each one did. 14 residents were carried out to a staging area at the end of a gravel road in Vinton County, Ohio, before sunrise on February 26, 2026. 2 residents connected to the extended network have not been located. The review panel has not issued its findings, and the question of how many residents passed through that address over 11 years in a system that looked in 3 times and left satisfied does not yet have a complete